What if I told you that everything you're taught about American history is a lie? That's right, a white, devil-damned lie. A lie that's hiding a secret so heinous, so explosive, that if it was revealed, it would change the very fabric of how Black history is understood in America. Yep, that's right. Everything we're taught in school, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, has been rewritten in front of our very eyes. And what if I told you this erasure of Black history is still happening? Today, on Black Stories Untold, we're uncovering it all. When the Confederacy lost the Civil War in 1865, they lost everything. Southern wealth plummeted by 60%, and nearly 300,000 of their sons, fathers, and brothers were 6 feet underground. Their entire economic system, built on the backs of enslaved people, was destroyed. Their cities were burned, their economy shattered, their entire way of life gone. But while most of the South was trying to rebuild, one man was busy rewriting. His name was Edward Pollard, editor of the Richmond Examiner, and he was about to write the book that would change American history forever. The Lost Cause, a new Southern history of the War of the Confederates. This book essentially became the propaganda's blueprint. You see, Pollard understood something crucial. They say history is written by the winners. But Pollard knew that if you control how history is written, you control the narrative. And in those pages, he laid out exactly how to do it. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. First, rewrite the cause of the war. While Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens had proudly declared in 1861 that their new government was founded on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, Pollard and his supporters pushed a different story. According to them, the South fought for states' rights. They were noble defenders of their homeland against Northern aggression. And enslavement? Well, apparently, that was actually good. But Pollard didn't stop there. He and his fellow Lost Cause writers turned Confederate generals into saints. And none more so than Robert E. Lee, the most successful military commander of the Confederate Army. Lee became more than just a general. They transformed him into a Christ-like figure, the ultimate Christian soldier who they claimed only reluctantly took up arms to defend his state of Virginia. After his death in 1870, they elevated him to almost godlike status, even calling him the Second Washington. Never mind that he led an army against the very nation Washington helped create. Confederate soldiers weren't fighting for enslavement. They were heroic warriors defending their homes against invaders. And the South's defeat? That wasn't because their cause was wrong. No, it was simply because the North had more men, more guns, more resources. They were just overwhelmed. It sounds absurd, right? That the losing side of a war could just rewrite history? But here's the thing. Pollard's book became the very foundation for a systemic campaign to reshape American memory, a campaign so effective that its lies are still repeated today. Because just 1 year after Pollard published his book, something started happening across the South that was truly shocking. While Confederate men were busy writing their version of history, Southern women were about to turn that story into reality. It started innocently enough. In the aftermath of war, women across the South formed memorial associations to collect the bodies of Confederate soldiers and give them proper burials. But these weren't just grieving mothers and widows. They were seeds of something much more powerful. In 1869, Confederate veterans, including Braxton Bragg and Jubal Early, formed the Southern Historical Society, and their mission was to defend every aspect of the Confederate cause through published papers and speeches. But it was what happened next that would change American history forever. In 1894, a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy was born. These women had the most insidious plan to control what children were learning at the time. That's right. We all know education has perhaps the biggest impact on kids when they're young. And if you teach your next generation that the Confederacy were fighting a noble cause, what do you have? You have another generation of bigoted, hateful, and ignorant people, exactly the sort of people who would perpetuate an obvious lie. Within just a few years, the UDC had grown to 100,000 members strong, They had chapters beyond the South and across the entire country, and they wielded their power with surgical precision. At the heart of this operation was Mildred Rutherford, an educator and author who created something called a measuring rod for textbooks, a manual that would determine what version of history American children would learn. The system was brutally effective. Any book that didn't match their version of history was marked with "unjust to the South" and removed from the library shelves. Any textbook that mentioned the horrors of enslavement or the true causes of the Civil War were banned from classrooms. But they didn't stop there. They created the Children of the Confederacy, where young Southerners were required to memorize the Confederate Catechism, a call and response system that drilled their twisted version of history into children's minds. Kids as young as 6 were taught to recite truths about the Confederacy, competing for rewards as they absorbed these lies. They staged elaborate ceremonies where school children were arranged into living glass at monument unveilings. And those Confederate monuments you see in town squares across America, the ones causing so much controversy today? Yeah, the UDC put those there. They didn't just build statues, they placed them strategically in front of courthouses, in town squares, anywhere they could cement their version of history in stone. But reshaping Confederate memory was just the beginning. These women had an even darker, more disturbing goal. You see, after the Civil War ended in 1865, America entered a period called Reconstruction. For the first time, the federal government tried to make good on the promise of freedom, passing the first Civil Rights Acts in American history and constitutional amendments that guaranteed Black citizenship and voting rights. Black Americans seized this opportunity. They were voting, getting elected to Congress, building schools and businesses, and creating their own newspapers. They were living proof that the lost cause narrative was a lie. So the architects of the lost cause did something ingenious. They made sure Black voices would never reach the history books. Remember those textbook guidelines created by Mildred Rutherford and the UDC? They didn't just promote Confederate heroes. They systematically removed any mention of Black achievement. The Freedmen's Bureau, Black congressmen, the Civil Rights Acts, all erased. But they went even further. As Reconstruction was giving Black Americans unprecedented freedom, a group of white Southerners emerged with a mission to take it all away. They called themselves the Redeemer Democrats. Democrats who wanted to redeem the South by returning it to white. These redeemers couldn't be as obvious as they were during Confederate days. No more riding around in masks intimidating Black voters. Instead, they had to be subtle. So they created a two-pronged attack. On the ground, radical groups like the Red Shirts and White League used violence to drive Black voters away from the polls. Suddenly, owning people as property wasn't a brutal system anymore. It was reimagined as a teaching experience, where enslaved people became more civilized. Some lost cause writers even claimed that enslaved people had better lives than British working-class people. And here's the worst part. By the time Jim Crow laws were firmly in place, there was no one left in power to challenge those lies. When that wasn't enough, they created new stereotypes, straight from lost cause propaganda, meant to portray Black Americans as unprepared for freedom. These were weapons designed to justify segregation and the complete reversal of everything Black Americans had achieved during Reconstruction. But here's where this story takes an even darker turn. You see, the South was about to pull off something unprecedented. They were going to make the North embrace their lies. From the White House to Hollywood, from college classrooms to children's movies, the lost cause was about to become America's official story. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. You'd think America would reject the propaganda of traitors who nearly destroyed the Union. But not only did the North welcome the lost cause with open arms, they taught it in their schools, screened it in their theaters, and ultimately helped turn Confederate mythology into American history. And here's the most disturbing part. This was endorsed by presidents, taught by Ivy League professors, and celebrated in blockbuster films that Americans still watch today. So how does the winning side of a war end up adopting the sore loser's version of history? The answer starts with a funeral. In 1885, Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who had defeated the Confederacy, was being laid to rest. Among his pallbearers were former Confederate generals Joseph E. Johnston and Simon Bolivar Buckner. Let that sink in. The man who crushed the rebellion was being carried to his grave by the very men who fought to preserve enslavement. While it was a funeral on the surface, it was actually America announcing that white reconciliation mattered more than historical truth. By the 1890s, Northern public opinion had shifted dramatically. Americans had grown disillusioned with Reconstruction and were eager to move on from the divisiveness of the Civil War. In 1898, President William McKinley made this reconciliation official. When America declared war on Spain, he deliberately appointed former Confederate General Joseph Wheeler to lead the cavalry division. As one historian put it, President McKinley purposely chose ex-Confederate General Joe Wheeler as head of the cavalry division, thereby symbolically reunifying the nation through an ex-Confederate. But this reconciliation came with a terrible cost. To welcome the South back into the national fold, the North had to accept the South's version of history, and that meant embracing the lost cause, a lie that the war was fought over states' rights, not what it was really about, and keeping black people in an inferior socio-economic class. But here's what you might not realize. This wasn't just about healing wounds. There was something much more insidious happening behind the scenes, because for propaganda to become history, you need the stamp of academic approval, and that's exactly what the lost cause got. The American history profession was still in its infancy. The first history PhD in America was only awarded in 1882, and the American Historical Association formed in 1884. These early historians saw themselves as nation builders, writing history backwards as if the United States had always been destined to exist, and the lost cause got wrapped up in all of that. At Columbia University, Professor William Archibald Dunning created what became known as the Dunning School of Reconstruction History. These historians portrayed Reconstruction as a terrible mistake where vengeful Republicans punished the South and incompetent black politicians corrupted state governments. The Dunning School became a powerful tool for white. Dunning himself was a redeemer whose work gave intellectual legitimacy to Jim Crow laws and the disenfranchisement of black voters. Meanwhile, Frederick Jackson Turner, one of the most influential historians of his time, was actively minimizing enslavement's importance. In 1893, Turner wrote, "When American history comes to be rightly viewed, it will be seen that the enslavement question is an incident in the period from the end of the first half of the present century to the close of the Civil War." Turner told Americans, "Don't focus on the enslavement. Look west. The frontier, not the plantation, was what made America exceptional." But perhaps no academic did more damage than Woodrow Wilson. Before becoming president, Wilson was a historian who legitimized the lost cause through his scholarly work. He believed the white knights had saved the South from what he called black domination. Think about that for a second. A future president of the United States writing that an evil organization saved America. When Wilson won the presidency in 1913, he brought these views into the White House, resegregating the federal government and purging black employees from positions they had held for decades. But Wilson's most damaging contribution to the lost cause was yet to come, and it would change American culture forever. In 1915, a friend of President Wilson, named Thomas Dixon, wrote a novel which was adapted into a film by D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation. It was America's first true blockbuster, a technical marvel that revolutionized filmmaking. It was also one of the most evil and discriminatory films ever made. The film portrayed the white knights as heroes who saved white Southern women from savage black men, who were played by white actors in blackface. Its climactic scene showed triumphant white knights riding to restore civilization to the South. And where was this piece of Confederate propaganda first screened? The place where it can do maximum damage, the White House. The film was a sensation, seen by millions of Americans. And as a direct result, the White Knights, which had been largely inactive since the 1870s, experienced a massive revival. Some of its strongest chapters weren't even in the South, but in places like Indiana. That's right. A single film inspired millions of Americans to join a radical and evil organization. That's the power of propaganda when it has the government's seal of approval. Hollywood was just getting started. In 1939, Gone with the Wind hit theaters. Another blockbuster that romanticized the antebellum South and portrayed enslavement as a benign institution where happy enslaved people were loyal to their kind masters. The film portrayed Reconstruction as a time when the South was ravaged, ignoring the civil rights progress and democratic reforms of the era. Then, in 1946, Disney released Song of the South, a song that describes the wonderful relationship between master and enslaved. Even in the Western genre, perhaps America's most iconic film tradition served to minimize enslavement by focusing on the frontier instead of the plantation, exactly as Frederick Jackson Turner had advocated. In The Searchers, widely considered one of the greatest Westerns ever made, John Wayne's character proudly declares,
"A man's only good for one oath at a time. I took mine to the Confederate States of America."
Just like that, Confederate soldiers weren't traitors. They were honorable men who simply had competing loyalties. These films are still being watched and celebrated today. And that leads to an uncomfortable question. What other propaganda might we still be consuming without realizing it? Because by the early 20th century, the lost cause needed to evolve to continue spreading. As Confederate soldiers aged and died, their children formed offshoots like the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. In 1893, the Confederate Veteran magazine began publication, eventually reaching hundreds of thousands of readers until it ceased publication in 1932. This magazine became the official mouthpiece of the Lost Cause movement. What emerged from these efforts was a sanitized version of the Lost Cause that emphasized heritage rather than hatred. According to this new narrative, Confederate symbols were simply part of Southern identity, a way to honor ancestors who fought for what they believed in. This transformation was remarkably effective. What started with Mississippi's state flag in 1894, a clear symbol of Jim Crow, eventually became just part of Southern culture. By the 1970s, you had the Dukes of Hazzard on primetime television, with a car named General Lee sporting the Confederate flag while playing Dixie on its horn. And millions of Americans didn't bat an eye, because by then it had been successfully rebranded as Heritage Not Hate. This watered-down mythology allowed Confederate symbols to spread far beyond the South. By the mid-20th century, the Confederate flag appeared everywhere from college dorm rooms to rock concerts. And by the 1930s, the Lost Cause became officially American history. Generations of Americans learned that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, and the Reconstruction was a terrible mistake driven by vengeful Northerners. Meanwhile, they learned almost nothing about the 200,000 black soldiers who fought for the Union, black politicians elected during the Reconstruction, and the systematic campaign of terror that overthrew Reconstruction governments. But the most disturbing part in all of this is that the Lost Cause didn't fade out in the 1930s. It's still with us today. Look around you. That Confederate monument in your town square, the textbooks being debated in school board meetings today, and the political fights over how American history is being taught in schools. They're the front lines in a 150-year propaganda campaign that's still shaping America right now. And what makes it truly dangerous is that most Americans don't even realize they've been influenced by it. In 2015, a high school student in Texas noticed something strange in her textbook. The section on enslavement described enslaved Africans as workers who came to America seeking jobs. There was no mention of kidnapping, chains, or human ownership. When she posted a photo of the textbook page online, it went viral. The publisher, McGraw-Hill, one of the largest educational publishers in the world, eventually apologized and promised to fix the language in future editions. As recently as 2010, the Texas Board of Education, which influences textbook content nationwide, approved standards that minimized enslavement's role in causing the Civil War and required teaching the positive aspects of American enslavement. A 2018 survey by the Southern Poverty Law Center found that only 8% of high school seniors could identify enslavement as the central cause of the Civil War. 2/3 didn't know that it took a constitutional amendment to end enslavement. When students don't understand, they can't understand the racial inequalities that persist today. That's not education, that's indoctrination. So what does it say about America that we have more monuments to traitors who fought to preserve enslavement than to the enslaved people themselves? In 2019, the New York Times launched the 1619 Project, an initiative aimed at reframing American history by placing the consequences of enslavement and the contributions of Black Americans at the center of the national narrative. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Politicians condemned it as propaganda and introduced bills to ban it from schools. Some historians criticized specific claims, while others defended the project's core premise. The same pattern emerges in debates over critical race theory, which is a legal framework that examines how racism is embedded in institutions and systems rather than just individual prejudice. Despite being primarily taught in law schools, not K-12 classrooms, critical race theory has become a catch-all boogeyman for any discussion of systemic discrimination in American history. We're still fighting that same battle that began in 1866, between those who want to confront America's history of racial injustice honestly and those who prefer comfortable myths. The Lost Cause taught Americans that history could be whatever they wanted it to be, that uncomfortable truths could be buried beneath comfortable myths, that reconciliation was more important than justice. And that lesson has been learned all too well. But propaganda, no matter how powerful, cannot survive when confronted with the truth. That's why understanding the Lost Cause means recognizing how historical narratives shape our present and future. When we understand how the Lost Cause rewrote history, we can see more clearly how similar propaganda campaigns operate today. We can recognize when politicians use coded language to appeal to racial resentments, when media outlets sanitize uncomfortable truths, when textbooks gloss over America's darker chapters. We can become more critical consumers of history. The truth is that America has always been both a land of extraordinary promise and profound contradiction, a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal while enslaving millions of human beings, a country capable of remarkable progress and horrific injustice.